Ms. Geetika Joshi. Yeah. I'm with the California Department of Food and Agriculture. I manage our produce safety program, which is one of several programs or units under our inspection services division. And this particular program is 100% federally funded, and our primary mission is to educate as well as um, help like farms comply with FSMA produce safety rule regulations, which includes inspecting these farms for the produce safety rule as well. We have, I want to say, like maybe a medium-sized team where we have inspectors all across the state that are helping cover different agricultural and growing regions. Um, and then within the Inspection Services Division, we also have the Inspection and Compliance Branch, which is home to several other food safety audit programs that are either like USDA gap audits or even like public-private partnership audits like the Leafy Green Marketing Agreement, which is specific to California and Arizona, or the Cantaloupe Advisory Board audit program. So those are more commodity-specific food safety audits. And audits and FSMA inspections are different from each other in terms of, they're both all about food safety, but FSMA inspections are not commodity specific as long as they are fresh produce. And they don't, usually farmers have to pay to be part of an audit program and get an audit. Having those type of audits can also sometimes get them help meet requirements from specific buyers. FSMA, on the other hand, is considered like the baseline minimum of food safety expectations and regulations, and they don't cost anything. They're free of cost. So I will be talking specifically about the FSMA produce safety rule that's within the purview of our program. And, listening to today's conversation, I think it's important to just share that the FSMA produce safety rule is very specific to microbiological contamination and prevention of foodborne illnesses due to that. So primarily things like E. coli, Salmonella, Listeria, just the biologicals, and not so much of PFAS or microplastics or physical or chemical contaminants and toxins and adulterants. Those would specifically kind of fall under the larger purview of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and California has its own regulations regarding that as well. This produce safety rule is very specific to the microbiological component. And that's relevant from a composting perspective, right? So we can talk about that. And what I wanted to share today was like, what does the produce safety rule say about compost or soil amendments? Before we even dive into the requirements under FSMA, it's also important to understand like who is regulated under FSMA, right? And it's farms that grow, pack, harvest, or hold fresh produce. And fresh produce is defined in the law in a very layman terms. These are crops that would be consumed fresh, like farm to table, without being cooked or without going through a processing step that might, what we call a kill step that might destroy microorganisms. So California is pretty much it's producing more than 3/4 of the nation's fresh vegetables, fruits, and nuts, all your garden crops, your leafy greens, and all of those types of crops. So produce farms have a large footprint on California ag, and therefore FSMA and produce safety rule are really significant in our state. We estimate something like 20,000 produce farms, and we're trying to verify these farms as we go and try and inspect them as well. So in terms of that, who's responsible for complying with the produce safety rule? It is the farm. It is the entity that conducts those growing, harvesting, packing, or holding activities. And compost really comes into it comes into play during the growing stage of the crop primarily. So it would more than likely be the actual grower, the farm, which would be responsible. Um, when it comes to soil amendments, the produce safety rule very specifically has a subpart called subpart F, and it's biological soil amendments of animal origin and human waste. So what that tells you is that, there is this.
Ritika, sorry to interrupt. Do you have a link to that?
Yes, I'm actually just parking the link to the federal docket,
Okay,
which
wonderful.
has
Thank you so
the
much.
entire regulation. If anyone would be so inclined to read it, um,
Is
that's
there a place in here where I can find section F?
actually this is the FDA page. So you want to go to the actual federal docket, which is what the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR. That's that FDA 2011N0921, and then that's a really long document. So you would have to basically do a control left search. And let me write down the the term that I think is most helpful.
Okay, so comments. Here we go. Awesome.
Yeah. So this docket has the rule, and it also has, when the rule was being finalized, which it was in 2016, like all of the various public comments that they received and responses to it. So that is a very substantive document to get through. I'll just acknowledge that up front. But specifically, we'll focus on biological soil amendments of animal origin, or BSAAOs, or in our world, we also just call it BSAOs, just for convenience. And the law, what does it say about these BSAOs? It talks about requirements that apply to determining the status of a BSAO, and the status is like, is it treated or is it untreated? It talks about how must I handle, convey, and store these materials. What prohibitions apply about human waste, and I think we really probably don't need to spend too much time talking about the human waste component in this particular group. Um, Treatment processes that are acceptable for a BSAO that I apply from the growing of produce, microbial standards that apply to the treatment processes, and then also the application requirements or minimum application intervals, and also requirements related to record keeping that a farm should have. So treated and untreated, it's that's I think where we start, right? And it's considered as treated if it's been processed to completion to adequately reduce microorganisms of public health significance in order to requirements in another part of the law. But in a nutshell, what I would say is that the National Organic Program um, standards for compost and pathogen reduction, the time, temperature, logs, and turning requirements, those are considered as adequate under the federal produce safety as well, right? And to say that, okay, the compost produced at the end would be considered as a treated BSAO. And treated is the world where we want to be. I think one more thing I would mention is that it does very specifically speak to animal origin, right? So there's an inherent understanding of the science here that a lot of these microbial contaminants of concern in the produce safety rule, um, that those coming from animal origin are considered of specific concern, right? So when we think of a farm scenario, we're thinking of manure, like chicken manure pellets, those types of things. But this does become more complicated when we're thinking of a municipal waste stream, because there could be, food type things of animal origin that could be part of that feedstock. And then if it's not treated, it's untreated. And why the treatment versus not treated or untreated is important from a produce safety rule perspective is because then it kind of flows into what a farmer has to do to minimize the risk at every step of handling, conveying, and storing the material and applying it to the field, and so on and so forth. And as you can probably guess, right, the requirements for treated materials are a little bit more straightforward to follow. And there's a lot more of risk mitigation mindset needed for that untreated stuff. So the important thing to understand here is that especially, that in this group, we also talk a lot about compost production, commercial facilities. If they're permitted and they're following a documented pathogen reduction process, a full treatment, right? That's a great start. The perspective we are hoping to bring to the conversation is like, okay, we have now all these policies in California. We want to really increase the volume of compost that's being produced, that's being used. It's great for soil health. It's important for climate resilience. It's important for circular economy, waste management. And how do we ensure that it also doesn't change the landscape of food safety and food safety requirements, and is streamlined enough for a farmer to be able to switch sources as you may be, right? Because that's a market that is still not, adoption of compost application on fresh produce farms is pretty limited because the liability of foodborne illness risk at the back end sometimes tends to be so high. For a smaller, very small farm, it can put them out of business pretty quickly, right? So for that reason, at least it is our understanding that unless they're certified organic, like there tends to be skepticism. And where we want to come from is that education and outreach can help mitigate that, right? Like, not, we already have the regulations, and how do we make sure that people understand, like, okay, this is if I comply with all of this, the material is safe to use, because we know there's all these other benefits that this material gets. So from that perspective, a farmer has to know if they're commercially sourcing, they have to know if it's treated or not, right? Because they would need to keep those records with themselves. When, if somebody like us comes out for an inspection, we would be reviewing those records as well. So we want to make sure that that's the case. But then the farmer also needs to understand how to properly handle, convey, store this material. So the job isn't done with just procuring treated material. They also have to take efforts on their parts to make sure it doesn't get recontaminated during the handling, conveying, storing, and application part. And then in terms of, like I said, the treatment methods, those universally kind of more universal NOP type composting standards are considered adequate. The law also talks about like more details of acceptable treatment, microbial standards and testing. So, for example, it specifically says for listeria, the microbial standard is non-detect using a method that can detect 1 CFU per 5 grams. Salmonella, also non-detect, similar. E. coli 0157H7, non-detect. So those are specifically defined in the law. For treated materials, yeah.
Oh, sorry. I just want to chime in with a question really quick. Maybe for some of the composters in the room, are those things that are a part of like standard either STA testing or no?
No.
Okay, interesting.
Great, thank you. That's a good question. Yeah. And then the last piece I was just going to spend a little bit of time on in terms of application requirements. Again, if the material is treated, then there aren't really application intervals required under the law. Like what we mean by that is if you're applying something to your field, it would really depend on what stage of growth, and that would depend on what crop you're growing, right? That you apply the compost, and does it introduce a risk of the edible portion of the crop to come in contact with that material? And if the material is untreated, then the farmer has to really keep in mind and make decisions so that the fruit or that crop is not coming in contact with that material. Maybe it's applied at a certain stage of growing. With treated materials, there are no application interval requirements. So again, there's that understanding that these have been treated to adequately reduce that risk, and so therefore those interval requirements are not there. So in a nutshell, for this particular group and discussion, right, like what are some of the things we are thinking of in our program? And also, our program is still relatively young. Like we've had, we work with FDA through 5-year-long cooperative agreements, and we've had 2 cooperative agreements so far. But the first 5-year round, there weren't really a lot of inspections going on. That was more of like education outreach, and even just getting different, all the different states have programs like us or most of them do. So getting the states kind of started up and understanding what kind of programs they need to even start. In the second cooperative agreement, which is ending this year in June, that's when we've really had a chance to set up our programs and hire people and get inspections going and kind of understand what's going on in the fields. And we are now actually in the stage of putting together our next 5 years proposal to the FDA for federal funding. Just given everything that's impacting federal stuff right now, we actually haven't yet submitted this proposal. Typically, we would have by now, but we're still waiting on that. But one of the components that we are working on proposing, and we've had some conversations, so we'll see. At the end of the day, everything depends on federal approval because it's 100% federally funded. But we really want to have some funding that's dedicated towards outreach, education, and technical assistance for farms on how to procure and use compost materials safely on their farm while still having that benefit that you can get from all those materials, but also having assistance in terms of ensuring that it's being done in a manner that's safe to use for food production, and also helps them comply with all the different legal and audit requirements as the case may be. And the reason why we are really expecting that to be a growing need it has been a growing need in California forever, but even more so because of bills like SB 279, where it even increases the exclusionary tier for farmers to produce their own compost, or even AB 411, which will allow composting of animal carcasses in it's a very limited way, and that type of compost cannot be transported out. But we know that there are animal operations that sometimes will also have land where they're growing crops as well, right? So all these things are important in making sure that those education gaps don't stay unfulfilled. I used to work in our Healthy Soils program before, and now the team that Dana is part of, they have some really great technical assistance model. One of the things we're thinking of at the department is if you're going to a technical assistance provider that can help you design your compost application project for Healthy Soils, could they help you connect also to resources that will help you do it in a way that's good with the food safety requirements as well, so that a farmer could get that information in one place in a consolidated manner. So those are some of the topics that are kind of burning for us and we're thinking about, especially as we think about what the next 5 years of our program would look like with the changing landscape in California. But I just want to close my part of the presentation is that from a production side, right, to really get this conversation bigger, if we start with a treated product, it helps makes things easier for everybody to start with, right? Like from a farmer's perspective, it's a lot more complex for them to think about the untreated material, how they're going to use it, how they're going to apply it while still minimizing their food safety risk, and how are they going to document it, versus there's so much work done already in the treated composted space where we know that there's proven processes and ways to document temperature logs and things like that can help folks have a little bit better on-ramp, right, in trying to get to that endpoint while still also having that food safety mindset. So I'll just stop there, and hopefully that's enough information to get a conversation going. I'm happy to also provide more information about the rule itself and things like that. Matthew.
Yeah, first off, Geetika, thank you so much. That was great. Really appreciate you taking the time and suffering through all the introductions in our first hour of stuff.
No, I learned a lot. I'm like, oh, should I be thinking about having somebody in our team? Well, we apply for funding. If we get funding and we get to hire an education outreach person, then I'm like, oh, maybe that person should be taking that COTC training, which as of this morning, I didn't know existed, right? So I'm glad to be part of the group, and hearing everybody's introduction was very helpful.
We've never had anyone from any state agency take the training. That would be super cool. Love to do that because you guys do need a composting expert for sure. I have a bunch of questions. I'm pretty familiar with FSMA. Didn't pay that much attention to it because California was sort of at least early on, sort of beyond that. I guess I have a more sort of nitpicky question, and I haven't looked at it in a while, but just hearing you talk about it, I'm concerned that in fact there is quite a bit of compost and treated and untreated soil amendments that go on vegetables. I think you're right. Most of that probably is organic, but quite a bit of it isn't organic, or even though it's sold as organic, the farms themselves are not certified organic. So it'd be great if we knew a little bit more about that. I don't know how much data you guys have or we could have on that, but because I'm
Yeah.
and I come from a much more municipal space, the food waste stuff, the cities and counties stuff, but there's it I recently looked at the amount of manure. We generate more manure just in the Central Valley than all the solid waste, not just the little part that we compost, but the entire solid waste that we generate in the state. So there's massive amounts of manure, and that's all pretty much goes to land. And I would guess the vast majority of it isn't treated. But the stuff that is treated, I guess every time I heard you say you're leaning on the NOP, I kind of winced a little bit because they took the federal 503 time and temperature requirements and kind of garbled them, and they're not the same, and they don't meet the definitions, and it's really unclear what those are or if people are meeting them. And then when you talk about Listeria and EHEC and other, non-detect E. coli 157, who I don't know any manure composters testing for any of that stuff. There are some big manure composters that meet Title 14. They have permits. They do the time and temperature plus the lab testing, because all the permitted sites, as you know, have to do the time temperature, the temperature records, and the lab testing. Quite a few of these manure composters are on a dairy. They're somewhere on the side. They just don't do it. They're not doing any of that. So I'm just curious if the department has a plan to sort of look at that, or
Those are
are you?
excellent comments, Matthew. And I think there were maybe four questions that I counted. I'll try to
Sorry. Yeah,
get through it.
at least.
But
Sorry.
if I miss anything, like please definitely egg me on more. So to start with data on compost application, we don't have that, right? It's mostly coming from our empirical and anecdotal sort of conversations.
Yeah.
And I'm speaking from the point of view of like working with HSP in the past. We knew we needed to increase the uptake of compost, right? That was a big reason why those incentive programs started, which may or may not mean that there wasn't already enough uptake of compost, right? But we wanted to grow it. So maybe that's where I'm coming from a little bit. And then shifting into the food safety space, you're right. It's a lot. There is a lot being used, but our understanding is it's primarily certified organic. And then a lot of the larger farms that are part of bigger interstate commerce and international commerce, they tend to be really, really, really skeptical of food safety related liabilities at the back end, especially those that have been involved in outbreaks in the past or have had to deal with foodborne illness outbreaks that trace back to their farms. So some of that skepticism that we do encounter, I want to say is real, but I wouldn't be able to give you a quantitative scale for it.
Oh, that's right.
But maybe that's where we want to, but that's where there's room for intervention and that opportunity, right? Because there's been advancement in everything, including composting. From the perspective of the Central Valley and compost production, you're right. Again, it's a little bit of what I'm going to say is empirical and maybe just my view, and it may be different. From what we'd seen working, I used to work in our dairy programs too in the past, and what I understood was a lot of the untreated manure and manure water for silage crops and field crops, but for human consumption crops, we don't know if that's a big share and if that share has been growing or if it's going to grow. But we do know that in parallel, now that we've had all these manure methane related programs in the state, and it's producing a lot of like that digested manure byproduct at the end, CDF it is hosting or has been hosting another group called the Manure, and I will mess up the full form, but it's MRIP, and there's a manure, there's a research and innovation and something in there to be thinking about what kind of products could come out of even those type of materials, right? And at the end, like all of this needs to go on our human food farms is kind of the perspective. So that's kind of where we're coming from is, okay, what do we see as barriers right now? And really, can those barriers be addressed through the education, outreach, and technical assistance space more than anything? Because those might be much more helpful for the farms to access directly than to give it like a regulatory cover. And then last question that I remember from you, I'm saying NOP, that might be just my interpretation of not understanding the nuances of how this is different, but the FSMA itself actually doesn't reference the NOP. It specifically
Okay.
defines the requirements, and maybe
Right.
it was I'm not the best expert, so maybe when I read that and NOP, I was like, maybe they're the same, but to your point, maybe there is a nuance there that I may have missed, but I can read these out, and they are in the
No, that
regulation folder as well.
no, I'm pretty sure. I think the key is just that I think in the space that most of the people on this call are in, we have a certain definition or understanding of what pathogen reduction is from Title 14 and other things. And I think when I talk to dairymen and other composters who are in different space, they have a very different definition and very different requirements for that. I don't know any of them that are doing. A lot of them are do temperature from a process standpoint, but then are they backing that up with any lab testing? And then even going beyond the lab testing for what you're talking
And
about.
some
So,
of it could be commodity dependent as well. So, there's fresh produce, but then even within fresh produce, right, there's categories. And the way you can minimize risk on tree crops and orchards, which a lot of our valley has, can look very different from what it might
100%.
look like on a leafy green farm with a sprinkler, like an overhead sprinkler irrigation system, where water droplets can fall and create even like more micro droplets of stuff that's on the ground. So it starts to get really nuanced when we think about our 400 plus different specialty commodities, most of which meet the definition for fresh produce under the federal law.
I think you're right, though, too, that some of these companies, these big international companies, the exporters, try to comply with gaps and things. They're driving a lot of the changing behaviors, the better adherence to this. So there's some
another
gaps there.
Interesting one I'll just mention is almonds, because almonds are technically a fresh produce, but actually all of California almonds are processed through pasteurization kill step. So
Right.
they have what is called a federal enforcement discretion, and even though technically this rule would apply to them, but because they're going through a kill step, it doesn't. What that means is that at a growing stage, and in terms of using a treated versus untreated material, that could look very different on almond farms than it would on a walnut or pistachio farm that are not pasteurized at the back end.
That's a great example, because I know almonds use a ton of
the
compost, they
acreage
use a
of
ton of
almonds
manure.
in those areas close to dairy farms is immense.
So big,
right?
Yeah, 100%.
So those things kind of start adding up, hopefully, even though we haven't done actual analysis and I don't have real numbers, but this is just observations, and maybe they're potentially correlated, maybe they're not.
It's a very big animal. Yeah. Anyway, great talk. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. I enjoyed a lot of it, so I need to refresh my understanding of it. So thank you.
Very informative. Thank you.
Thank you. But yeah, we would love to keep the conversation going, because we really want to grow as a program in this and there's interaction of animal and produce farms in California that you just cannot avoid, regardless of everything that we know scientifically about the food safety and E. coli part of it. And we really are wanting to grow our education arm for all of those reasons, because at the end of the day, the farmer needs to be able to call someone and ask questions and get answers, which we as regulators can't always be we can't, because we can't then regulate them on information that we gave them ourselves. So we are really hoping to find ways to grow more. And from that perspective, we did start sharing in 2021 with the Monterey County Farm Bureau. It's specific to Central Coast, but we want to grow it across the state, a group called California Ag Neighbors, to start having these conversations between animal operations, produce operations, composting, vineyards, because vineyards is another great example. Wine grapes are under an enforcement discretion because alcohol production is a kill step. So what they can apply on vineyards is very different from the perspective of the federal law as to what can go on table grapes, even though you would think of grapes and vineyards being vineyards. So these conversations are becoming really important from our perspective, and that I'll park the link to California Ag Neighbors. And we are actually starting a work group number 5, just in a nutshell. this group has had 4 work groups over the last 3 years and 2 reports that have come out. You'll see them all on the webpage that I park. And now we're getting a work group number 5 started to start thinking about some shared solutions that are cross-sector and potentially some management practices that are cross-sector to help minimize the overall lens of food safety risk. So, I can also reach out, Katya, maybe through you and send some information, see if there's any interest in folks like joining and engaging in that work group 5 from
Absolutely.
a close perspective. And I'll also check back with my director as well on that and get back. So that's been some of the work we've been trying to do. FDA also led like a 5-year long study in that region, in the Central Coast region, to look at like how are microbes getting introduced onto produce farms through a large scale environmental sampling that went over for 5 years, up and down the Salinas Valley. So there's just, it's, at the end of the day, it's like, yeah, food safety. And yes, you can think about 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 pathogens, but it's an ecosystem. And we have to be thinking of it from an ecosystem perspective with all of the different inputs, outputs, and all the different players, and risk management exists at every part of the ecosystem, right? And that includes soil inputs, includes compost, it includes things that we can't control, like wind.
Thank you so much for coming and sharing all of that, Geetika, sorry.
Thank you.
That was really awesome. I learned so much. I've been hearing a lot about food safety for a while, but you explained it really wonderfully. Really appreciate that. The ACP Education Working Group, different from the one that you've heard earlier today, the one we were talking about earlier today is our specifically like school and teacher focused group. But our other education working group that does like webinars and stuff, is planning on doing a food safety webinar presentation at some point later on this year. So if you're open to participating in that, just let me know. That could be really cool to put together and sort of deepen this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. We'd love to engage in any way possible, Katya. And we do have an outreach specialist in our team as well. And hopefully by fall, she's on maternity leave right now. So maybe by fall, she'll be back as well and we can connect more. Thank you.
Cool. That sounds perfect. All right. Well, we've got 5 minutes left until the end of the meeting. Anyone have any last things they want to say or share or anything else?
Appreciate everybody's participation, input, enthusiasm, work that they're doing in this space, and it's great to get everybody together and talk about all this kind of stuff. So, thanks for setting this up, and thanks for joining everybody. I don't think I have anything else.
Happy Healthy Soils Week.
That's right. What's going on in the Katya household for that? You're having a cake?
I'm doing this. This is the first thing I did this morning.
Nice.
Yeah, super happy to be here with everybody. As always, feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. If you want to get involved with ACP, if anything you heard today is interesting to you, you can always check out the agenda that's linked in the invitation. If you have trouble finding it, I can send it to you as well. But that has notes from our Healthy Soils roundtables going back like a year or 2. So there's a lot of really cool resources in there, and you can see what different people have been talking about for a while. It's really cool to see how a lot of the things we talked about a couple of years ago are now sort of coming into fruition.
Merging, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Have a good one. I'm going to go ahead and exit out the meeting.
Thank you, Katya.
Thanks, Katya.
Thanks, everybody. Great stuff.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.
Bye now.
Bye.